Hi everyone, it's John Mitchell. In this video we're going to look at the centralised and decentralised employee relations system. It's going to be a bit of a longer video than normal because this is an area that students have really struggled with in the past, so I just want to focus on a few different areas to make sure that you understand this topic really well. So firstly, we'll start with the centralised employee relations system, and Australia's had a centralised system from 1904 until the 1990s. It came in because there were these massive strikes in the late 1800s, and once sort of federation came along, the government decided that they wanted some involvement in, or a fair amount of involvement in, how wages and working conditions were decided, so that these mass amounts of industrial action didn't take place. So as a result, in 1904, they introduced a centralised system, and we had that through to sort of the late 80s, early 90s. And a centralised system is where the government and their tribunals set the wages and working conditions for an entire industry. Now, they do this through a type of agreement called an award. Now, a lot of people ask, well, what does it mean by the government and their tribunals? Well, if we move to the next slide, you can look at the government body, which back in the day was called the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission. It's changed names to the Australian Industrial Relations Commission. It's what we know now as Fair Work Commission. So they would be involved with a union or a peak union and an employer association or a peak employer organisation, and they would negotiate on what the wages and working conditions would be for a particular industry. Now, when I say a particular industry, I mean the whole industry. We're not talking about just a few organisations within the industry. We're talking about the entire industry. So if it was the shearers industry, it would be all of the shearers within that industry. If it was, during manufacturing, it would be all the organisations that fit under manufacturing, etc. So the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission, or the government body, call it whatever you want because it has changed names lots of different times in the past, they would go through what's called conciliation or arbitration to figure out what the wages and working conditions would be in that particular industry. And so the union would obviously represent the employees, and the employer organisation would represent the employer in this negotiation. Now, we'll get into what conciliation and arbitration are in a second, but this is one of the tribunals. This is when we talk about the government and their tribunals. So the government heavily involved there at the top. That's the government body, and these tribunals would take place where each party could have their say, and they try and work out what would meet the needs of those particular organisations and those employees, and they would come in with an agreement, and that agreement was called an award, and an award covered an entire industry. Alright, so going now on to what is conciliation and arbitration. So again, we're sort of focusing on the tribunals here. Conciliation is where a third party, an independent third party, participates in the resolution of a dispute and attempts to resolve the differences through discussion. However, the final decision is still made between the two disputing parties, so the organisation and the employees. They'd still actually resolve the dispute together. However, the government body under a centralised system would be heavily involved in trying to help them through making discussion, trying to help them actually resolve that particular dispute. Now, arbitration is actually very similar in terms of the setup. However, it's a judge or a panel of judges that hear the arguments from both disputing parties. So the employees or their representative would put their case forward, and the employer representative would put their case forward. And as a result, in terms of resolving the dispute, the judge or the panel of judges would make the final decision, and that decision was binding by law. So that's what arbitration is. The decision is then taken out of the two disputing parties' hands, and it is forced upon them. But they do get to have their say, obviously, just like in a normal court where you get to put your case forward. Now, the advantages and disadvantages, it's important that you know these. So advantages we've got, there's more equality for workers in a centralised system because the award covers an entire industry and covers all the organisations within that particular industry. And the government has greater control over the wages because they're more involved in the decision making. They're involved in the conciliation and arbitration, involved in those tribunals where wages and working conditions are decided. So as a result of that, they have, I suppose, more involvement or more control over the management of the economy. Now, there's stability and predictability because the same rules apply to all organisations within a particular industry. They all fall on the same award. Remember, the award is that agreement that came out through the conciliation and arbitration. Now, the disadvantages is there's less flexibility for organisations. If there's something that was they didn't want to abide by in the award, they had to, even if it didn't really make sense for their particular organisation. So there was less flexibility in how organisations could use employee relations to really meet their needs. And productivity gains at individual workplaces can't be rewarded with better working conditions. So you can't, the employees can't go to the employer and say, right, we want a higher wage and better working conditions, and the employer go, well, that's fair enough, let's negotiate, and we'll negotiate to say that if you improve productivity, I'll do that. That's taken out of their hands. It's more centralised. So remember, centralised meaning at the top, where the power is at the top, where the government and those tribunals make the decision on what the wages and working conditions are for that particular industry. So there no longer is there that real bargaining between employees and employers in terms of what really suits their needs, and what's one of the disadvantages. As a result, large industrial disputes, because the award or the agreement covers the entire industry. So it's the entire industry that's fighting for better paying conditions, not just one particular organisation. So, in a dispute, sometimes it would be, the whole industry that would go out on strike. And as a result, under a centralised system, the amount of days lost through industrial action are much greater than what they are today under our decentralised system. Now, a decentralised employer relations system is where the wages and conditions are negotiated at workplace level through enterprise bargaining. So now all of a sudden, rather than it being taken out of the organisation's hands and the employees' hands, where yes, they have representation, but it's sort of decided by the government and the peak employer bodies and the peak unions. Now all of a sudden, they can negotiate at workplace level, at their actual workplace. So enterprise bargaining is where the employer and the employees are able to negotiate their wages and conditions. So now employees and their representative or their union can go to the employer and say, okay, we want a new agreement, it's about to expire, let's negotiate some better wages and conditions. And as a result, the employer can also go, yep, fair enough, no worries, but we want to negotiate in increased productivity. We want to improve productivity for the organisation. Now, so those agreements that came out of enterprise bargaining were called enterprise bargaining agreements, or you might see the letters EBA, and that's what that stands for. Now, it's important to note that the awards that came from the centralised system still exist. They still exist today. They've existed all the way through our decentralised system. However, they are used as a safety net for employees within a particular industry. Some industries will actually some organisations will still use the award as their main agreement. However, majority of organisations use one of these enterprise bargaining agreements, and so they negotiate above the award. However, it's important to note that the enterprise bargaining agreement cannot go below the award. The award is there as a safety net for employees. So, as I said, the EBA is negotiated above the award and cannot undercut the particular award for that industry. So what we had before was where the government, the unions, or the peak unions and the peak employer associations would get together and they would negotiate and figure out an award. Now that still exists, however, to work out what the awards are. However, for workplace agreements at an individual workplace, now it's simply the employees and or their representatives of their union and the employer and or their representatives, and they negotiate on what the wages and working conditions will be for that particular organisation. So it gives great flexibility for organisations and employees to fight for better wages and conditions that meet the needs of the organisation, so that they can also achieve their objectives through improved productivity, etc. So now we're decentralised because no longer the main agreement's taken out of the employer and the employee's hands. Now we can do it at individual workplace level. So the advantages for that is, as I said, the increased flexibility. Organisations can tailor and employers can tailor the wages and conditions to really suit their needs. There's enhanced communication between the employer and the employees, although that might break down at times if there's a dispute, but there's enhanced communication because now they are negotiating together. Productivity gains can be rewarded, that's a real benefit, and so wages now are tied to productivity gains. If employees want increased wages, that's fair enough. We'll tie it to how well we improve productivity within the organisation. And so it becomes a system where it's not just the employees demanding higher wages, it's also the organisation demanding that we get something in return for those higher wages. Disadvantages is that there's a greater gap between the equality for skilled and unskilled workers, because obviously if you are skilled, highly skilled, you have more bargaining power than unskilled workers. The government has less control over the wages in the economy because they have less involvement in what the wages and working conditions that individual organisations are. And as a result, because the bargaining or the negotiation is done at workplace level, disputes can actually last longer. So there's lots of examples. You know, the CFA and all the fire departments are, you know, I think they've been going 2.5 years before their agreement. So the important thing now is, all right, what are the similarities and differences between these two systems? So to start off with the similarities, both systems relate to how wages and conditions of employment are determined. That's a real, taking it back to its real bones. That's the key similarity. Now, one of the main similarities is that both systems still use awards. We've spoken about that, how the awards were the main agreement in a centralised system, and now they set the bare minimum for a particular industry. They exist in both systems. The awards are still a really important part of both systems. Another centralised element in our decentralised system, so it's a similarity, is that the government still sets the minimum wage, and that's done with involvement from the peak unions and the peak employer organisations. They still have quite a bit of say in what the minimum wage is, and that's reviewed each year. The government body, which is currently the Fair Work Commission, can still be involved in conciliation and arbitration, which, you know, still gives, I suppose, the government some, at times, if need be, some control over what the wages and conditions will be. So that system of conciliation and arbitration still exists, and Fair Work Commission can still be heavily involved in that if need be. However, the majority of the time now there's less third-party involvement. So the differences between the two systems, I've put these sort of, you know, on the left and the right to try and match these up. A centralised uses awards as the primary form of wages and conditions, whereas a decentralised uses awards as a safety net. So although a similarity is that they both use awards, the difference is how they use those particular awards. A centralised uses industrial courts and tribunals heavily when they're deciding on the wages and conditions, so that conciliation and arbitration tribunal, and a decentralised has limited third-party involvement. It's still there if they need it, but there's limited third-party involvement. Awards are determined by the government and their tribunals under a centralised system, and decentralised uses enterprise bargaining to determine wages at workplace level or at enterprise level. Centralised uses awards as pretty much the only agreement, whereas a decentralised uses awards, what we call collective agreements and individual contracts, and we'll go more in depth on those particular agreements in a future video. And as a result, what we've spoken about, there's lack of flexibility for the organisation under a centralised system to really tailor the employer relations to what they need, and under a decentralised system there's increased flexibility where productivity can be negotiated and rewarded with higher wages and conditions. So that's it for one of the larger videos of the course, and for questions, activities and more on this topic, then always come on over to teachingbubble.com.